Hey everyone, and welcome. Have you ever thought about this? How can someone be found guilty of a crime they didn't actually commit? Well, today we're jumping right into that fascinating legal puzzle. We're going to untangle this wild web of something called complicity and vicarious liability. So let's just start with the big question right up front. Is it even possible? And the answer, maybe surprisingly, is a big yes. It seems kind of strange, right? But it's a huge part of criminal law, and we're about to break down exactly how it works.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the story to set the scene, figure out who the key players are, dig into the legal tests, and then, this is the fun part, we'll throw in a corporate twist before we figure out who's ultimately on the hook.
Okay, to really get a handle on all this legal stuff, let's start with a story. Something simple, a classic bank heist. And in our heist, there are a few key players, and each one has a very specific job to do.
First up, meet the planner. This is the mastermind, right? The brains of the whole operation. They've cased the joint, disabled the security, planned every single move down to the second. But here's the thing. On the day of the heist, they're sitting at home, miles away. Next, you've got the robber. This is the person you always see in the movies. They're the one who actually walks into the bank, demands the cash, and physically carries out the crime. They are front and center, the main event.
And finally, there's the driver. They never even step foot inside the bank, but their role is absolutely critical. They're sitting outside, engine running, ready for that clean getaway. So you've got 3 people, 1 crime. The big question is, who's really to blame here?
You know, the law is pretty specific about this. It doesn't just throw everyone into the same bucket. It has special names, special categories to define exactly what role each person played in the crime. Let's dig into what those are. So the key concept here, the glue that holds this whole crew together legally, is something called complicity. And really, all it means is that if you intentionally help someone else commit a crime, you can be found just as guilty as the person who did the main act. In the eyes of the law, you're all in it together.
And this really breaks it down for us. On one side, you've got the principal, that's our rubber, the main actor. And on the other, you have the accomplices, that's our planner and our driver. See, even though they did totally different things, the law connects them all because their help made the crime happen.
Okay, but it's not that simple, right? How does a prosecutor actually prove someone was a helper and not just, some guy who happened to be standing on the corner? Being nearby isn't enough. The law has a very specific checklist they have to satisfy. So what is that checklist? What's the legal test they have to meet to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone was in on the plan and not just in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Well, it basically boils down to this 2-part test. First, prosecutors have to prove intent to assist. That means the person wanted the crime to happen and intended for their help to matter. Second, they have to prove participation, that the person actually did something to help, whether it was planning, driving, or just yelling encouragement. You need both a guilty mind and a guilty act.
All right, so our little heist seems pretty cut and dry. You've got your principal, your accomplices. Seems simple enough. But now, let's throw a wrench in the works. Let's see how this stuff applies in the real world, in the world of business.
Let's chew on this for a second. What if our getaway driver wasn't just some random guy? What if he was an employee of, let's say, Speedy Deliveries Inc., and he was using the company van for the getaway, while on the clock? Does that drag his boss into the mess?
And that question, right there, brings us to a whole different legal concept, vicarious liability. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Sometimes, the blame can travel up the ladder. In certain cases, an employer can be held responsible for what their employee does.
Now hold on, this doesn't mean a company is automatically on the hook for everything an employee does. I mean, can you imagine? That would be chaos. So the law draws some really important lines here to keep things fair and define what a company is truly responsible for. And the biggest, most important line is this: was the employee acting within the scope of their employment? For our delivery driver, was being a getaway driver part of his job description? Probably not. The law has a great phrase for this. They call it an employee going on a frolic of their own. But think about a nightclub bouncer. If they use too much force, the club could be liable, because using force is part of their job. The act, while illegal, was related to their employment. See the difference?
Okay, let's bring it all home. We've met the crew, we've learned the legal lingo, and we've even pulled a company into this whole mess. Let's put all the pieces together and see who actually has to pay for the crime.
So this table lays it all out pretty clearly. The robber, He's the principal. He's guilty. The planner and the driver, they're accomplices, just as guilty because of the doctrine of complicity. And the company? Well, that's where it gets tricky. They're potentially on the hook, but it all comes down to that scope of employment test. And in our story, that's a really, really tough case for a prosecutor to make.
And that brings us to a huge, modern-day puzzle that courts are wrestling with right now. In today's gig economy with delivery apps and contract drivers, that line between employee and independent contractor is getting blurrier and blurrier. So if the person delivering your pizza commits a crime along the route, where does the company's responsibility begin and where does it end? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.